The classroom buzzed with a faint hum of whispered conversations as students shuffled in, sliding into their desks with practiced ease. Among them was Mia, a petite girl with round glasses that seemed slightly too big for her face. She quietly settled into her seat at the back of the room, her posture shrinking as if she were trying to disappear into the shadows of the classroom walls. Mia was the kind of student who went unnoticed, blending seamlessly into the background, her soft voice barely audible during roll call. In stark contrast, at the front of the room stood Miss Hartman, a tall, stern woman with sharp eyes that seemed to pierce through anyone who dared step out of line. Her reputation preceded her: strict, no nonsense, and, as many students whispered under their breath, unforgiving. Miss Hartman prided herself on being a disciplinarian, a teacher who believed that order and control were the keys to success. She had little patience for what she called unremarkable students, and Mia, with her quiet demeanor and unassuming presence, fell squarely into that category. "All right, class, settle down." Miss Hartman's voice cut through the low hum like a blade, commanding immediate silence. The students froze in their seats, their conversations dying out as they turned their attention to the front. "Today, we're diving into advanced calculus. I hope you've all done your homework because I won't tolerate mediocrity." Her gaze swept over the room, lingering momentarily on Mia, who instinctively lowered her head, avoiding eye contact. Mia was used to this. She had spent most of her life being overlooked or underestimated. Her quiet nature often led people to assume she lacked confidence or, worse, intelligence. But what they didn't see was the fire burning beneath her calm exterior. Mia was smart, brilliant even, but she had learned early on that it was easier to stay under the radar than to invite unwanted attention. As the lesson progressed, Ms. Hartman began calling on students to solve problems on the board. Hands shot up across the room, eager to avoid her wrath. Mia kept her eyes fixed on her notebook, furiously jotting down notes and working through the problems on her own. She didn't need to participate to know she had the correct answers. But then it happened. "Mia." Miss Hartman's voice rang out, dripping with a mix of disdain and challenge. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to the back of the class. Mia's heart sank. "Come up to the board," Miss Hartman continued, her tone laced with impatience. "Let's see if you've been paying attention or if you're just here to take up space." Mia hesitated, her mind racing. She could feel the weight of the room's gaze pressing down on her. Slowly, she rose from her seat, clutching her pencil tightly as she made her way to the front. The whispers started almost immediately, faint murmurs of doubt and amusement from her classmates. As Mia reached the board, Miss Hartman handed her the marker with an arched brow, gesturing toward the complex equation scrawled across the surface. "Solve it," she said curtly, stepping back to observe. Mia stared at the board for a moment, her mind already working through the problem. She could feel the heat of Miss Hartman's scrutiny and the silent judgment of her peers. Taking a deep breath, she began writing. The room was silent, save for the faint squeak of the marker against the whiteboard. As Mia's hand moved steadily, solving each step with precision, a flicker of something unexpected crossed Miss Hartman's face: doubt. But just as Mia was about to finish, Miss Hartman interrupted, her voice sharp and cutting. "Are you sure about that? It doesn't look right to me." Mia paused, her heart pounding. She turned to face her teacher, her eyes meeting Miss Hartman's for the first time. There was no fear in them, only quiet determination. "I'm sure," Maya said softly but firmly. The room seemed to hold its breath, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. For the first time, Miss Hartman found herself unsure. And then, just as the moment teetered on the edge of resolution, the classroom door swung open, breaking the spell. The principal stood there, his expression serious, and his words sent a ripple through the room that no one saw coming. The classroom froze as the principal stepped inside, his gaze scanning the room with quiet authority. He was a tall man with silver-streaked hair and a commanding presence that silenced any lingering whispers. In his hand was a folder, thick with papers, and his expression was unreadable. "Miss Hartman," he said, his tone firm but calm. "May I have a word with you outside?" Miss Hartman's lips pressed into a thin line, her annoyance barely concealed. She glanced at Mia, still standing by the board, then back at the principal. "Of course," she replied, setting down the marker. "Class, continue working on the problems I've assigned. I expect no disruptions." With that, she followed the principal into the hallway, the door clicking shut behind them. The classroom erupted into murmurs as soon as they were gone, a mix of curiosity and relief at the unexpected interruption. Mia returned to her seat, her cheeks burning from the attention. She could still feel the weight of her classmates' stares, their whispers like tiny needles prickling her skin. "What do you think that was about?" a boy near the front muttered to his neighbor. "Probably some parent complaint." The other replied with a shrug. "Miss Hartman's always ruffling feathers." Mia ignored the chatter, focusing on her notebook as she flipped the page and started writing. She wasn't working on math problems anymore. Instead, she was sketching out a series of equations and notes in the margins. Her thoughts were racing, not just from the earlier tension with Miss Hartman, but from the strange look on the principal's face. Something about his expression had unsettled her, as though he knew something no one else did. Minutes dragged by, and the classroom door finally opened again. Miss Hartman re-entered, her face pale and her jaw tight. She didn't say a word as she walked back to the front of the room, her movements stiff and controlled. The principal didn't follow her, and his absence felt oddly significant, as if whatever conversation they'd had carried a weight that lingered even after he was gone. "Continue working," Miss Hartman snapped, her usual sharpness now tinged with something else. Was it unease? Her eyes darted briefly toward Mia before she turned her attention to the papers on her desk. Mia noticed the glance and felt a flicker of uneasiness herself. She couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had just happened involved her in some way. But how? She hadn't done anything to draw attention to herself, at least not intentionally. The rest of the period passed in a tense silence, the air heavy with unspoken questions. When the bell finally rang, students hurried to gather their things, eager to escape the oppressive atmosphere. Maya lingered at her desk, her movements slow and deliberate as she packed her bag. She could feel Miss Hartman's eyes on her, watching her with a scrutiny that made her stomach twist. As Mia stepped into the hallway, she was surprised to find the principal waiting near the door. He looked down at her with an expression that was almost kind. "Mia," he said, his voice softer than she expected. "Do you have a moment?" She hesitated, glancing back at the classroom, where Miss Hartman was still seated, her eyes narrowing at the sight of the principal speaking to Mia. Swallowing her nerves, Mia nodded. "Sure," she said quietly. The principal led her down the hallway to his office, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. Mia's heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing with questions. What did he want? Had she done something wrong? When they reached his office, he gestured for her to sit in one of the chairs across from his desk. The room was neat and organized, with shelves lined with books and awards. A family photo sat on the corner of his desk, a reminder that he was more than just the figure of authority students saw in the hallways. "Mia," he began, sitting across from her, "I want to start by saying that you've done nothing wrong. In fact, I've been meaning to speak with you for a while." Her confusion deepened. "Me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, leaning forward slightly. "I've noticed your work in the past few months, your grades, your projects. You're an exceptional student, Mia, but I also see that you've been holding back, keeping a low profile. Is there a reason for that?" Mia stared at him, unsure how to respond. She'd spent so long trying to blend in, to avoid standing out, that the idea of someone noticing her felt almost alien. "I just prefer to keep to myself," she said finally. The principal studied her for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "I understand that," he said. "But I think you have a lot of potential, and it's important that you know that. Not everyone will see it right away, but that doesn't make it any less real." Mia wasn't sure what to say. The principal's words were kind, but they also left her feeling exposed, as though a part of her she kept hidden had been brought into the light. Before she could respond, there was a knock at the door. It opened a moment later, and Miss Hartman stepped inside. Her face was calm, but her eyes were sharp as they flicked between Mia and the principal. "Am I interrupting?" she asked, her tone cool. "Not at all," the principal replied smoothly. "I was just having a quick chat with Mia." Miss Hartman's lips twitched into a tight smile. Good. I wanted to remind you about the staff meeting this afternoon. Of course, he said, standing. Thank you for the reminder. Miss Hartman lingered for a moment longer, her gaze settling on Mia. There was something in her expression that Mia couldn't quite read, something guarded and calculating. Run along now, Mia, Miss Hartman said, her voice sweet, but with an edge that sent a shiver down Mia's spine. Maya stood quickly, mumbling a polite goodbye to the principal before slipping past Miss Hartman and out into the hallway. As she walked, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, the weight of Miss Hartman's gaze following her long after she had left the office. The rest of the day passed in a blur, but the tension lingered, like a storm brewing just beyond the horizon. Mia didn't know what it all meant, the principal's kind words, Miss Hartman's strange behavior, but she had a sinking feeling that things were about to change, and not necessarily for the better. The evening sunlight streamed through Mia's bedroom window as she sat at her desk, her notebook open in front of her. The equation she had jotted down earlier now filled the page, surrounded by arrows and tiny annotations, but her mind wasn't focused on the math. It was stuck replaying the strange events of the day. The principal's words had stirred something inside her, a mix of pride and unease. No one had ever called her exceptional before, at least not in a way that felt genuine. And then there was Miss Hartman, whose demeanor seemed to shift like a shadow, unpredictable and unnerving. Mia sighed, leaning back in her chair. She glanced at her bookshelf, its rows neatly lined with textbooks and novels she'd read countless times. Books had always been her refuge, a place where she could lose herself and forget about the pressures of the outside world. But tonight, even they couldn't quiet the restless energy humming inside her. At dinner, her parents noticed her distraction. "You've been quiet, sweetheart," her mom said, setting a plate of pasta in front of her. "Something on your mind?" Maya hesitated, twirling a forkful of spaghetti as she debated whether to say anything. She didn't want to worry them, but the weight of the day was too much to keep bottled up. "It's just school," she said, finally keeping her tone light. "Miss Hartman called on me in class, and then the principal talked to me afterward. It was weird." Her dad looked up from his plate, his brow furrowing. "Weird how?" Mia shrugged. "I don't know. He said I was a good student and stuff. But then Miss Hartman came in, and she seemed annoyed. It's like there's something going on that I don't understand." Her mom exchanged a glance with her dad, her expression cautious. "Maybe it's nothing," she said gently. "But if you ever feel uncomfortable or like something's wrong, you need to tell us, okay?" Mia nodded, appreciating their concern, but unsure how to explain the uneasy feeling that had been gnawing at her all day. That night, as she lay in bed, Mia couldn't sleep. Her thoughts kept drifting back to the moment at the board, to the way Miss Hartman had interrupted her. There was something almost deliberate about it, as if the teacher hadn't wanted her to finish. But why? The next morning, Mia arrived at school early, hoping to avoid any more awkward encounters. The hallways were quiet, the usual chatter and laughter muted in the early hour. She made her way to her locker, lost in thought, when a voice behind her made her jump. "Hey, Maya." She turned to see a boy from her class, Jacob, leaning against the lockers with a curious expression. He was one of the more outgoing students, always cracking jokes and earning easy laughs. "Hi," she said cautiously, unsure why he was talking to her. "So, what's the deal with you and Miss Hartman?" he asked, folding his arms. Mia blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" Jacob smirked. "Everyone's talking about how she's been giving you a hard time. And the principal pulling you out yesterday? That's not exactly normal." "I don't know," Maya said quickly, her cheeks flushing. "It's nothing, really." But Jacob didn't seem convinced. "You're hiding something," he said, his tone teasing but with an edge of curiosity. "Come on, you can tell me." "There's nothing to tell," Maya insisted, turning back to her locker. Jacob shrugged. "If you say so, but watch your back. Miss Hartman's not the type to let things go." His words sent a chill through her, and she couldn't shake the feeling that he knew more than he was letting on. By the time first period started, Mia was on edge. She avoided eye contact with Miss Hartman, keeping her head down and focusing on her notes. But it was impossible to ignore the subtle tension in the room. the way Miss Hartman's gaze seemed to linger on her longer than anyone else. As the class worked on a group assignment, Mia overheard snippets of conversation from the desks around her. "Did you hear what Miss Hartman said about Maya?" "Yeah, she called her out yesterday. Bet she's trying to prove something. Or maybe Mia's just a teacher's pet." The whispers stung, but Mia forced herself to stay focused. She wouldn't let their words distract her, not when she knew the truth was more complicated than they realized. At lunch, Mia found a quiet corner in the library, hoping to escape the prying eyes and murmured rumors. She opened her notebook, flipping to a blank page, and began writing. It wasn't math this time. It was a list of everything that had happened since Miss Hartman had first singled her out. The way she spoke to Mia, the tension during class, the principal's strange behavior. As she wrote, patterns began to emerge, threads that connected seemingly unrelated moments. Mia paused, staring at the page. Could it really be that simple? Or was she just imagining things? Before she could think too deeply, the bell rang, signaling the end of lunch. She closed her notebook and headed to her next class, her mind racing with possibilities. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, but the tension lingered like a storm cloud that refused to dissipate. Mia felt it in the way her classmates watched her, in the clipped tone of Miss Hartman's instructions, in the unease that settled in her chest every time she thought about the principal's words. As she walked home that afternoon, Mia couldn't shake the feeling that she was on the verge of discovering something important. But the closer she got to the truth, the more dangerous it seemed. She just didn't know how far she was willing to go to find out. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the street as Mia walked home, her steps slower than usual. Her notebook felt heavier in her bag, its contents tugging at her mind like an unfinished puzzle. She kept going over the moments that stood out, the sharpness in Miss Hartman's tone, the principal's oddly kind words, the stares and whispers from her classmates. None of it fit together neatly, and yet Mia couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something important, something right in front of her. That evening, she sat at her desk, flipping through her notes again, the scribbled list of incidents staring back at her. She tried to approach it logically, just like she did with her math problems. There had to be a pattern, a reason why Ms. Hartman seemed so intent on singling her out. The principal's encouragement felt genuine, but it only added another layer of complexity to the situation. Why would he take such an interest in her when no one else ever had? And why did Miss Hartman seem so rattled by it? Mia's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of her phone buzzing. She glanced at the screen to see a text from Jacob. * you okay? Heard some stuff today. LMK if you want to talk. *. Mia frowned, unsure how to respond. She didn't trust Jacob, not completely, but there was something in his message that felt different from his usual teasing. Before she could decide, another text came through. Also, don't stay late after school tomorrow. Just trust me on this. Her heart skipped a beat as she stared at the message, her mind racing with questions. What did he mean? Why was he warning her? And what could possibly happen after school? She typed out a quick reply, asking him to explain, but he didn't respond. The unanswered text left her uneasy, the sense of something bigger lurking just beneath the surface growing stronger. The next day, Mia arrived at school with her guard up. The hallways felt different, quieter, almost tense, and she couldn't tell if it was her imagination or if something had shifted. She kept her head down, avoiding unnecessary interactions, but the stares from her classmates felt more intense than before. Even Jacob seemed distant, giving her a brief nod in passing but saying nothing. In class, Miss Hartman was colder than usual, her sharp gaze landing on Mia multiple times throughout the lesson. It was as if she was waiting for something, her movements precise but oddly distracted. Mia's unease grew with each passing moment, the atmosphere in the room heavy with unspoken tension. When the bell finally rang, Mia gathered her things quickly, eager to leave. But as she stepped into the hallway, Miss Hartman's voice called out behind her. "Mia, stay behind for a moment." Her stomach dropped as she turned back, meeting Miss Hartman's steely gaze. She glanced around, hoping someone might linger, but the hallway emptied quickly, leaving her alone with the teacher. Reluctantly, she stepped back into the classroom, the door clicking shut behind her. Miss Hartman stood by her desk, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. For a moment, the silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. "Do you know why I asked you to stay?" Miss Hartman finally said, her tone low but firm. Mia shook her head, her palms sweating as she clutched her notebook tightly. "I've noticed a pattern with you," Miss Hartman continued, her words deliberate. "You seem to think you can outsmart me, that you're better than everyone else in this room." Mia's eyes widened. "I don't think that," she said quickly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Don't lie to me," Miss Hartman snapped, her voice rising. "You've been hiding behind that quiet act, pretending to be invisible. But I see through it. I see you." Mia's heart raced as Miss Hartman stepped closer, her presence looming. She had never seen the teacher like this before, her usual composure cracked and replaced by something almost desperate. "Whatever game you think you're playing, it ends now," Miss Hartman said, her voice cold. "I don't tolerate arrogance in my classroom." "I'm not trying to." Mia started, but Miss Hartman cut her off. "Enough," she said sharply. "You're staying here until we sort this out." Panic surged through Mia as she realized the door was still closed, the faint sound of the next class beginning down the hall. She didn't know what Miss Hartman was planning, but every instinct told her she needed to leave. Before she could say anything else, the classroom door swung open, and the principal stepped inside. His expression was calm, but there was a tension in his posture that set Mia on edge. "Miss Hartman," he said, his voice steady but firm. "A word, please." Miss Hartman stiffened, her eyes narrowing as she glanced between Mia and the principal. For a moment, it seemed like she might refuse, but then she nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Mia, wait here," the principal said, his tone gentler as he gave her a reassuring nod. Then he and Miss Hartman stepped into the hallway, the door closing softly behind them. Mia let out a shaky breath, her mind racing. She could hear their muffled voices outside, the principal's calm but firm, Miss Hartman's sharper, almost defensive. Her hands trembled as she opened her notebook, flipping to the list she had written. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but the picture they painted was more troubling than she could have imagined. The voices outside grew louder, and Mia caught snippets of their argument. "You're crossing a line. She needs to be put in her place. This is not how we handle things." Mia's breath caught as the tension in their voices escalated. She glanced at the clock, realizing she'd already missed the start of her next class. Whatever was happening, it was bigger than her, and she wasn't sure she wanted to know how it would end. Mia sat frozen in her seat, her notebook open but forgotten on her desk. The voices outside the door were growing louder, and each muffled word seemed to send a fresh wave of tension through her. She didn't know what was happening, but the principal's calm tone clashing with Miss Hartman's sharper words told her it wasn't just a routine disagreement. Her pulse quickened as a thought crept into her mind. What if this wasn't about her at all? What if there was something bigger, something hidden, that she had accidentally stumbled into? She replayed the strange moments in her mind, the principal's sudden interest in her, Miss Hartman's hostility, the cryptic warning from Jacob. The pieces didn't fit neatly, but they pointed to something larger than her awkward stumbles in class. The door suddenly opened, and both adults stepped back into the room. The principal's face was calm but tense, while Miss Hartman's expression was tight with frustration. "Mia, you're free to go," the principal said, his voice kind but firm. "We'll discuss this later." Mia hesitated, her instincts screaming that something was off. Miss Hartman avoided her gaze, instead focusing on the floor, as if willing the moment to pass. With a quiet nod, Mia gathered her things and hurried out of the room, the weight of their conversation pressing down on her like a storm cloud. As she walked down the hall, her mind raced. What had just happened? Why had the principal intervened? And why did Miss Hartman look so rattled? The questions churned in her head, but no answers came. She was almost to her next class when she heard hurried footsteps behind her. Turning, she saw Jacob jogging to catch up. "Hey," he said, slightly out of breath. "What happened back there?" "I don't know," Mia replied honestly, clutching her notebook tightly. The principal showed up, and then they started arguing. He told me to leave. Jacob frowned, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting someone to be watching them. Something's not right, he said quietly. Miss Hartman's been acting weird all week, and now this? It's not normal. Maya's stomach tightened. What do you mean? Do you know something? Jacob hesitated, his eyes darting around the empty hallway. I've heard rumors, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. About Miss Hartman. People say she's been in trouble before, like serious trouble, but nothing ever sticks. The school always covers it up. Mia stared at him, her mind reeling. Why would they do that? Jacob shrugged. I don't know, but I do know she doesn't like people standing out, especially if she thinks they're better than her. She's got this thing about being in control. His words sent a chill down her spine. It explained so much. Her constant criticism, the way she seemed to target Mia for no reason, but it also raised more questions. If Miss Hartman had a history of this kind of behavior, why was she still teaching? Before Mia could ask, Jacob leaned closer. Be careful, he said urgently. If she thinks you're a threat, she won't let it go. The warning lingered in Mia's mind for the rest of the day. Every glance from Miss Hartman, every whisper from her classmates, felt heavier with the knowledge Jacob had shared. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that every move she made was being scrutinized. That evening, as she walked home, the unease turned into determination. She couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. Whatever was happening, she needed to know the truth. Once home, she opened her notebook and flipped to her list, adding everything Jacob had told her. Patterns began to emerge, subtle details she hadn't noticed before, connections that hinted at something much darker than she'd imagined. The next morning, Mia arrived at school with a plan. She avoided Miss Hartman's class, choosing instead to spend the period in the library. The quiet hum of the space was a welcome relief. What she uncovered sent shivers down her spine. Studies. There were old news articles. She searched for anything she could find about the teacher's past, mentioning allegations of misconduct at previous schools. Nothing concrete, just whispers and rumors that seemed to disappear as quickly as they surfaced. But one detail stood out. In every case, the school had quietly moved her to another district, avoiding public scrutiny. As she stared at the screen, a new thought struck her. What if Miss Hartman wasn't just targeting her because of her academic success? What if it was something else? Something more personal? The bell signaling the end of the period jolted her from her thoughts. Shoving her notes into her bag, Mia hurried to her next class, her heart pounding. She needed to talk to someone, to figure out her next move. But as the day went on, the tension only grew. Miss Hartman seemed more agitated than ever, her sharp comments cutting through the air like knives, and Jacob was nowhere to be found, leaving Mia feeling more isolated than ever. By the time the final bell rang, Mia was exhausted, but no closer to understanding what was happening. As she made her way to the front doors, she caught sight of Miss Hartman talking to the principal, their expressions tense. Mia paused, staying out of sight as she watched them. Something about their body language made her stomach twist. Whatever was going on, it wasn't over. In fact, it felt like it was just beginning. Mia's heart raced as she stayed hidden behind the corner. Her eyes locked on Miss Hartman and the principal. Their conversation looked heated, though their voices were too low for her to hear clearly. Miss Hartman gestured wildly, her face flushed with frustration, while the principal remained calm, his posture firm but unyielding. Something in the way Miss Hartman moved, sharper, more frantic than before, sent a chill through Mia. Whatever was being said wasn't just about her anymore. It was something bigger. Suddenly, Miss Hartman turned on her heel and stormed away, her shoes clicking sharply against the tiled floor. The principal stood there for a moment, watching her go, his expression unreadable. Then he turned and started walking in Mia's direction. She panicked and ducked into a nearby classroom, hoping he hadn't seen her. Mia, came his calm voice from the hallway, sending her heart into overdrive. I know you're there. She froze, her mind scrambling for an excuse. But before she could think of anything, he added, It's okay. I just want to talk. Reluctantly, she stepped out of the classroom, clutching her bag tightly. The principal gave her a reassuring smile, though there was a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Come with me, he said gently. We need to discuss something important. Mia followed him down the hallway, her stomach churning with nerves. He led her to his office and motioned for her to sit. As he closed the door, the air in the room felt heavy, charged with an unspoken tension. "I owe you an explanation," he began, sitting across from her. His tone was steady, but there was a weight to his words. "You've probably noticed that Miss Hartman has been difficult. You're not imagining it." Mia blinked, startled by his bluntness. She hadn't expected him to acknowledge it so openly. "There's a reason for her behavior," he continued. "And it's not entirely your fault. Miss Hartman has struggled with certain issues for years. She's brilliant but deeply insecure. When she feels threatened, she lashes out. Unfortunately, her insecurities often manifest in targeting students who remind her of her own struggles." Mia listened intently, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. "But why hasn't anyone stopped her?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. The principal sighed, leaning back in his chair. "It's complicated. There have been complaints in the past, but nothing concrete enough to act on, until now." Maya's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" "Your performance, your resilience, it's brought everything to light," he said. "Other students have started speaking up, and with the information you uncovered." Mia's breath caught. "You know about that?" He nodded. "You're not as invisible as you think, Mia. Your curiosity and determination didn't go unnoticed. When I saw you in the library, I realized you were digging into something important. It confirmed what I already suspected about Miss Hartman's behavior." Before Mia could respond, the door to the office burst open, and Miss Hartman stormed in, her face a mix of anger and desperation. "You don't know what you're talking about," she shouted, her voice trembling. "I've given everything to this school, to my students, and this is how I'm repaid." The principal rose from his seat, his expression calm but firm. "Miss Hartman, please." "No," she interrupted, pointing a finger at Mia. "This is her fault. She's been manipulating everyone, turning them against me." Mia flinched but didn't look away. For the first time, she felt a flicker of confidence. She had done nothing wrong, and she wasn't going to let Miss Hartman intimidate her anymore. "This isn't about her," the principal said firmly. "It's about accountability. You've crossed the line too many times, and it's time for this to end." Miss Hartman's face crumpled, and for a moment, she looked more vulnerable than Mia had ever seen her. "You don't understand," she said softly, her voice breaking. I wanted to prove I was worth something." The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over them. Mia felt a pang of sympathy, but it was quickly overshadowed by the relief of knowing the truth was finally out in the open. The principal turned to Mia, his expression softening. "You've been through a lot," he said, "but your courage has made a difference. Thank you for standing up, even when it wasn't easy." Mia nodded, her throat tight with emotion. As she left the office, the tension in her chest began to ease, replaced by a sense of accomplishment. She had faced her fears and uncovered the truth, and for the first time, she felt like she could hold her head high. But as she walked down the hallway, something caught her eye, a small note tucked into the corner of her locker door. She opened it carefully, her heart racing as she read the words written in neat, deliberate handwriting. Asterisk, "This isn't over." Asterisk. Mia's blood ran cold. She glanced around, but the hallway was empty. Whoever had left the note was long gone. The victory she had felt moments ago was overshadowed by a chilling realization. The battle with Miss Hartman might be over, but the war was far from finished.